Right. We are looking forward to summer assessments, and maybe in June, we're thinking about an essay on this question: should we believe in God? So it's about time that we start to draw our thinking together and begin writing an essay on this. So, what I want you to do this lesson is to write an introduction and to write a first paragraph. Okay. Now, what I'm providing for you here is a template of some of the thinkers for and against the existence of God that we've considered. We've not yet considered Friedrich Nietzsche, who's one of the most interesting thinkers, and we'll spend a lesson on him in the coming weeks. That's, if you look at the little history of philosophy, there's nothing Nietzsche couldn't teach you, as they say. And on chapter 29, The Death of God, Friedrich Nietzsche, we will be looking at that in due course. A very colourful character, Nietzsche. How do you go about this? Well, your opening position is what we call your thesis in an essay argument, where you set out for the reader what your position is. You make it quite clear what you're trying to persuade them of. Okay, so an essay isn't somewhere that you sit on the fence. You know what your mind is. You've made it up from the beginning, and you want to persuade your reader to make their mind up just like you've made it up by the end of the essay. Okay, so you're going to give them a tour of arguments for and against the existence of God, but you're going to be kind of angling it, persuading them all the way along. Even when you're advancing counter arguments, you're doing it to kind of knock them down. Okay, so take a position. Now, you don't have to kind of go at either extreme. You don't have to say, oh, I'm all for this and I'm all for that position. You could argue for what we call a via media, a middle way, and say, I'm agnostic. The jury's out. I don't quite know. There are good arguments on both sides. I'm undecided for these reasons, and I'm undecided because I think there isn't sufficient evidence yet to make my mind up. But if you're more persuaded in one direction or the other, great, take that position and argue it. You're not going to lose marks for the thesis that you set out. It's all about the reasons and the evidence you bring forward, and for that purpose, your counter arguments are your friends, not your enemies. Try and bring up counter arguments and then meet them. So if you're taking a position, always try to take the wind out of your opponent's sails by giving them a fair day in court, listening carefully to them, and trying to meet their objections as honestly and carefully as possible. And if they've got good points, concede ground and accept that. Now, what I've done at the very end of this piece of paper is to set out some phrases. These are actually from Manchester University, and they are helpful for making comparisons and contrasts. This is to sort of introduce problems with a theory, and then the second set of phrases is to make comparisons, contrasts, or show similarities and differences. So grab some of those phrases so that you're not boring. You don't just keep saying somebody says this and somebody says that and another person says this, another person says that. Have a little bit of variety to the phrases. That's great to see. I'll just whiz you through some of these arguments, and you can pick any two and in your first paragraph set out one thinker, give them an opponent, and have a bit of a kind of ding-dong battle between them and come to a conclusion that supports your general thesis. And next lesson, guess what? We're going to probably go on and look at Nietzsche, but in subsequent lessons, we're going to be doing paragraph 2, 3, 4. Right? You get the picture, and by the end, you'll have built an essay, and that's what you'll go into the assessment with: polishing, refining, sharpening your essay. That's what we want you to do this year to become a good essay writer and a good philosopher. So, opening paragraph, Anselm's ontological argument. I know you love this. There are so many fans of the ontological argument. Not. He says that God is the greatest conceivable being there can be, and you cannot have anything greater. So if God is real, then that's a great making property, right? If you've got an idea of God, just a thing in the mind, in intellectu, that's not as good as something en re, in reality, right? So if there are two gods and one's just an idea and one's a reality, the one that's the reality has got an extra property, a great making property, and therefore the greatest conceivable being we can think of must necessarily be a real God, not an idea of God. Now, this didn't get underway for Aquinas. This is Aquinas in the 13th century, because he thinks really we are talking beyond our capacity to comprehend when we talk about God. God is only able to be spoken of by analogy. You know, we can only kind of think very loosely about a being as alien and grand and majestic and beyond comprehension as God. And therefore, we can't talk about the greatest being a human mind can conceive of, because it's likely to be an idol, you know, just a fiction of our own creation. So he thought it was nonsense. Other later thinkers thought it was nonsense. They said, like Kant, the only way you can know whether something exists or not is to go out and spot it, right? If I said, there are some grapes on my table here, you would say, well, I can't see any grapes. And then I would say, here are some black seedless grapes. And lo and behold, now we have the evidence. There are grapes on the table. Existence needs observation, or Kant had a fancy word, instantiation. So that's the ontological argument. A nice one to set up and knock down. You could say, look, it's been going for 1,000 years practically, and you know, Anselm invents it in the 11th century, and it's still around today. People are still arguing it. Alvin Plantinga is arguing it. So it's got legs, and some people think it's just a prayer that you meditate on God, and if you already believe in God on religious grounds, then it counts as a kind of prayer that confirms itself to you. You start with faith and you seek understanding, as Anselm, his motto was faith seeking understanding. He said, I do not seek to understand or have evidence and proof in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. So that way around, maybe it makes sense. But if you want a ground floor up argument based on reason, maybe it doesn't. Darwin. Now, Darwin, of course, came up with the evolutionary origins of human life and all life, the tree of life through natural selection and the survival of the fittest and adaptation to environment. We looked at this in detail last lesson. And for him, along with the death of his daughter Annie, this was the end of his faith. He stopped going to church, stopped believing in God, and for him, it was the intellectual integrity of realizing that the world was just a product of blind and indifferent forces. There's a lot of what we might call cruelty. He says, what a book a devil's chaplain could write about all the hideous and deformed works of nature. And it takes billions of generations of animals for humans to evolve on the planet. We are naked apes. We're not that different to humans, to apes. Darwin even observed his own children growing up and pointed out the similarities to apes that he'd worked with and observed. And on the Galapagos Islands, he saw how finches' beaks were perfectly adapted to the environment that they were in. And so Darwin thinks you don't need God as an explanation. You can have a perfectly natural scientific explanation for how you get from primitive amoeba to complex human beings. That view has come forward into the modern thinker, Richard Dawkins, who is what we call a neo-Darwinian, because he's drawing on evolutionary biology and genetics, as well as a fossil record, and he's a world-class biologist who's written lots of books like The Selfish Gene, River Out of Eden, The Greatest Show on Earth, and Dawkins wrote The God Delusion. He's increasingly shifted towards, I suppose, advancing secular atheist views by argument and evidence. And here are some quotes from his thinking. He says, a child is not a Christian child, not a Muslim child. Do not indoctrinate your children. Teach them to think for themselves, how to evaluate evidence and disagree with you. So those are two thinkers there. You could look at Blaise Pascal, who we were debating last lesson, and argue for and against that. You could look at Thomas Aquinas, who puts forward 5 ways to prove the existence of God. 3 of them are about the causal argument. And he's saying everything in nature is moving. The natural state of things is rest. If something is moving, it must be started. It can't be started by a being that is itself moved by something prior to it. It must have to be an unmoved mover, a first cause, a prime mover, and this we call God. So he puts forward 3 versions of the causal argument, and one of the design argument. He says it's like an archer who's firing an arrow, and the arrow is moving towards a target, and in the same way the world is orientated towards its goal. And that's Aquinas's contribution. We could go into a lot more detail there because he's such an important figure. And John Stuart Mill really brings out the problem of evil. He talks about just how a benevolent God you would expect to create a world where there was less wastage, less suffering, less length of evolutionary suffering. He was an agnostic or an atheist, and he emphasizes the problem of evil as the kind of great rock of atheism, as it's called, because it sort of dashes the hopes of many people when they see suffering and death before them. So he was an agnostic in Victorian England, and you might also mention there the debate that Leibniz had with Voltaire. Leibniz, of course, said that this was the best of all possible worlds. God could have made any world, but not worlds in which people are free, but they never do evil. So if they're free, then human beings will exercise their freedom, and some will get up to mischief. And therefore, that's not to blame God for that. That's just part and parcel of the world's upsides and downsides. You could create a race of robots, but then they wouldn't be terribly interesting, and love wouldn't be possible. So that's his view. So you could contrast that with, you remember we looked at Voltaire's Candide, where he's laughing at Dr. Pangloss, who's a version of Leibniz, and saying, Pangloss's optimistic philosophy that the best of all possible worlds involved Cunegonde, going through an awful lot of torture in her life, and Candide going through lots of misfortunes and duels and being beaten up. And then in the end, they're eating candied pistachios and citrons on their farm, and God meant this for the best of all possible worlds. Well, you can argue that to and fro. So the point I'm making is there are lots of thinkers. We'll come back to this sheet in the future, because I haven't covered the anthropic principle in much detail, and I haven't covered Nietzsche in much detail. So we're going to work on this. All you've got to do this lesson is to craft, right? And I don't mean just knock off very, easily a few words, but craft like a poem your introductory thesis. What is my position? Why? What arguments am I going to explore? And a little bit of a kind of boxing ring match between two thinkers, right? Let it go back and forth, because philosophy is a dialogue, not a monologue. It has to be argument, counter-argument, reply. That's the way the debate moves if you're going to score points. And by all means, draw on this phrase bank at the bottom to compare and contrast. So I hope that's clear. If you've got any questions, do post them up and ask, and I'll be on hand to answer.